Fondamentalmente ho cercato di sviluppare.
What I tried to do was to develop some guidelines on the work on the French art philosopher Georges Duberman, specifically 3 specific texts on the work on migration and transit, Pasecchi, Lonchi, Blanc-Soucy and Scores. In particular, this last one was translated into Italian. The first 2 texts are small booklets that took their inspiration on the topic of art and art performances, as well as the experiences of the author on the topic of remembrance and migration. Mickey Genarie and Maria Kurkota are 2 Greek directors who produced a documentary, Spectres of Haunting is the title of the documentary, on haunting presences. In other words, the haunting presences, the ghosts traveling on around Europe, the migrants, the thousands of migrants on the border between Macedonia and Europe, being there in transit camps. Didier Berman, the French anthropologist, actually talks about the setting up of a people and what makes these people into a real people, what makes it possible for us to actually talk about the people is the impossibility of overcoming the borders. And this from the Domini refugee camp. Actually, this willingness has in itself the strength of becoming a people. The Duberman actually focuses on the power and the image that these people have. And the image of the thought is sometimes something that is very, very simple, very tiny, that actually strikes for its immediate and symptomatic immediacy. We understand that this is actually the way in which the whole world breathes exactly in the same place in which this takes place. And Benham actually called it, after Goethe, as an originary phenomenon, an Urphänomen. In the case of asylum seekers, of migrants asking to enter Europe, Duberman actually identified something germinal, like a dialectic image. And what's the sense of that? The most important conceptual relationship of that is that of a haunting presence haunting Europe, starting at least from the Communist Manifesto of Marx and Engels. The haunting presences described are manifold. There's many of them. They are shouting. There are lots of voices and lots of expressions and faces. And this is something that should not be underestimated in trying to understand the interpretation and the becoming as a people. It's quite the opposite. You have lots of facets. You have the many different faces that represent basically the most important aspect and the truest aspect of this element. In this passage, Duberman highlights the value of the gesture as gestures. In other words, we're talking about human beings, all the cracks that represent their faces. And that's something which is foreign to our becoming a people. So we're talking about body, the bodies which really represent the staging of a people becoming a people. Where's the power now of these images? As Didier Huberman states, we are all the sons and daughters of migrants. We are the sons and the children of migrants who are coming back, our relatives who are coming back. So the use that we today make in Europe of the word identity refers to a form of identity that annihilates our own identity of recognizing ourselves in these people. He states that Europe has always been and will always be made up of peoples in the plural who basically stem from lots of genealogies, and it has always been characterized by internal and external borders. His migrants are haunting presences, they are specters, and as we understand them, it is their own genealogy which is actually brought to light. So a specter is actually external, foreign to the family. He always reappears according to Didier Huberman, so he is always something ancestral. For example, a faraway foreign relative, and we're always afraid of that relative because if he's coming back, that reminds us of what we are. So ambiguity, in this ambiguity you have a lot of the strength of this. You have the capacity of recalling a plurality of voices and rediscussing our own intimacy and identity. So we cannot state, according to the Huberman, starting from Curcota and Genari, that in this same video there is no lack of orientation of the migrants. Those who had the chance of watching the Spectres of Haunting documentary that was presented in 2016 at the Turin Festival, you can see that the choices of the directors are really indicative, because they help you understand what the meaning is of the small and decisive parts of the hands, of the faces, of all the peculiar elements that make the experience of migrants as something which is particularly meaningful. The direction techniques adopted by the two directors, the filming techniques adopted by the two directors, help us identify the lack of orientation that these people have felt in their specific situation. This is the consequence of a subjectivization that is forced upon the migrants on the part of the police, on the border police. They have a very simple desire. They want to go over the border, but actually the transit camp immobilizes them. So they want to pass the border to try and live where life is easier. They want to live as lawful subjects, as simple citizens, irrespective of the country. The important thing is that that's a state of law. They want to go over in order to be protected from, to be protected by international conventions. They're sort of cursed. And actually, in these temporary conditions, you have the ambiguity. So on the one hand, you have the critical, the constructivist ability that you can envisage. On the other hand, you have the ability to organize areas of lawfulness and suspensions of ordinance inside their own areas. The Huberman states that this is par excellence one of the most horrific miseries, one of the worst crimes, because you have the crimes, you have the political and tangible evidence, which is really shameful. And this is the example of how the European Union is trying to externalize asylum procedures. We will receive you, we will welcome you, but not here, elsewhere. And this is actually something to bear in mind from the point of view of those who were refugees. That's the application of colonialism, but it applied inside one's own borders. So human rights have been in human history put in at the center of the stage. They've been some kind of a legal illusion. So the Huberman states that there is some kind of a double link. They are under a law because that actually it is their right to go over the border, but as the transit is denied, actually it is not said explicitly what they can do, what they are allowed to do. The law forces them to become lawless. So the gesture of transiting becomes a paradox. On the one hand, you have something that looks to the future, and on the other hand, you have the gesture that commemorates the past, as if you were remembering the relatives. And here lies the meaning highlighted by the French philosopher on images. And actually here a reference should be made to the image of as the difference between the capacity of images and the capacity of isolating. So, but these asymmetries highlighted by the French philosopher are manifold. When Jean-Marie and Concorde talk about haunting presences, one should wonder where these haunting presences come from and since when. One first answer might come from the link of between these trains, the trains that we saw crossing the border in Domini, for example, the cargo trains, the cargo carriages, and by carriages we mean the ones which from Thessaloniki went to the concentration camp in the 1940s, the trains to Birkenau, the trains which are very, very different. But that's also a symmetry that has to deal with transit. On the one hand, you have the ban to transit and to cross, and on the other hand, you have national sovereignty or tourism as the most comfortable phase of a right that crosses border in order to reach the most protected areas. But memory, remembrance, is made up of lots of different aspects, and from there you have the chance of recognizing something new. So this is basically in the air. This is something that a memory that a witness can indicate as an authentic witness, when it is capable of coming back to us as a ghost to haunt us. So the image going back to time also offers another possibility. That's a bifurcation in history. So images produce new hypotheses, they enlarge our possibilities. Besides chronology, all these migration movements, according to Huberman, has a generic name, which is culture. Not so much the culture of cultural programs or curricula, but that in topological terms. In other words, what makes human beings as individuals who are capable of speaking and producing works of art, as well as to live in society. So when you lose this ability, you also lose the ability of civilization, of developing relations and culture in anthropological terms. So that is basically what you lose. So the specters, the haunting presences produced by Huberman is something that we have sort of set aside, something that we, in the experience of Domini, can observe thanks to the documentary. In this text of the French philosopher, we had the chance to see the central role played by images. In other words, we need to recognize the possibility that that represents for our conscience and the very same European civilization. D.D. Huberman had already talked and worked around these topics in a number of other texts. There was a text called Scorze, and looking at this text, that's a reflection around the life of the philosopher and his expressions in his experience and remarks on Birkenau. So actually his point of view to analyze what remains of those texts. So the relation of the text with the reader is actually mixed with thoughts based on a rhythm which is basically belongs to the reader, as if the philosopher tried to, in a way, focus on its points of view. So this is basically a very practical kind of experience. The reader basically focuses on the philosophical experience of the reader. And this passage is particularly important because it enables us to understand another passage of the understanding of Huberman, in other words, the relationship with materials and the tangible aspect of these days. So the cracks, the powders, the remains, what remains in these areas, the sense of actually what you find there as the traces, as microcosms where you can find possible narrations. Images emerge from materials, and these materials actually induce to the reflections in the text, and they induce us to think about the relation between past and present, on witness, on the need to imagine, on seeing ruins, on seeing ruins, for example, in the details. So you have fought a battle made up on ruins, and this means that the marginal role of places had a sense, had a meaning, and the very same materiality of the places. And this is a battle on bodies, on their physical characters, because the bodies were tortured or mutilated in these places, and the land returns them in small organic crests that emerge. So you have objects and also dusts that were deposited. So this testifies to the paradoxes highlighted by Huberman, like that of the paradox between the conservation and the life of the camp. So you have the boundaries. So you have this dichotomy between the background and what comes in the front. So you have the camp, which represent the background, the backdrop. You have sheds that were represented large areas. They act as a framework, and it is this framework that gives us the possibility to imagine, because imagining means escaping the burden of what is unimaginable. And here we are facing another conceptual pair, which is very important, as D.D. Huberman highlighted in Blanc Souci. We are facing a problem of memory and of witness. We are facing the vacuum, we're facing the gap. One of the main references that D.D. Huberman takes from Blanc Souci is this issue of gap, starting from Jos Perec. So, in other words, how we can question the ability of our own memory to cope with what is missing, with what we are not allowed to remember, with what is not connected, with a number of pictures which are some kind of snapshots. They are not flowing connections, they're not flowing pictures. So that's the meaning of bearing witness, and that has to deal with taking on responsibilities for these gaps. And Didi Huberman's proposal is that of bearing witness to accept the fact that you have a lack, that you have a gap to fill. And what our narration, what our narrative does is to interrupt a story for many different reasons. So you have silence reign again. So, and what it means to tell a story, does it mean to annihilate that story or to erase it? No, it rather means that you're taking a secondary road. You're taking a secondary road vis-a-vis the fact that the language is the primary road. So the story goes on, in any case, as if we in silence might be able to produce some kind of a deviation. So back to Scorza. The main text actually adds additional elements of reading and focuses on the traces, on the surfaces. So posing yourself questions on how to interpret those ruins with barbed wire and watchtowers has to deal with our ability to create connections between the backdrop and the forefront, between the experience and the frame. And this allows us to support the ambiguity of these relations. This can be done thanks to the look of the observer. So, when I talk about the look of the observer, of the archaeologist, this means that we have to question ourselves with a number of important questions. Can we actually remember without forgetting? Actually, the answer is that culture is not some kind of the tip of the iceberg, but it's basically a context in which primitive actions take place. So the look of the observer, the look of the archaeologist actually is something that is really living and intervenes when he or she judges meanings and consequences are drawn. For example, in the traces that emerge from the floors, because those are traces left by time. So that's the key to understand the consistency, and that lies in the gaze and in the attempt of the author to interpret those traces as surfaces that can help us remember. Those are places in which you have the chance to critically analyze memory. So what you get is not an inventory of objects, but rather the analysis to understand the present. So there's a moment in which the remains of the past are something meaningful, and they become something meaningful for the present. So looking at these traces means going through the various layers of our life, the images of our past and our own story, to then reach to the crossroads of our present, and that's an urgent present, and that has the face of migrants and domini. Thank you very much.